And this year, the city is celebrating a few milestones. The city turned 85 years old this past April. And in just a few months, the Merrick House is going to be celebrating its 100th anniversary. So we thought it was fitting to explore more of what George Merrick, the founder of the city, had planned for his City Beautiful. So joining us today with more insight on this topic is Joanne Lombard. She is a professor and architect at the University of Miami. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So it seems like Merrick thought of everything, basically. How common was it for developers of that time and developments such as this one to be so involved in every aspect of their development?
I think that it was common for a developer to think about the physical environment, the kinds of buildings and streets they wanted. What was uncommon was to have this larger vision that you could actually improve people's lives, that you could create a better world, that the life that you imagine for your citizens could be so complete as to include universities and art centers. So to that extent, I think Merrick stands out above all of the rest of his era.
Yeah. And there's some very interesting aspects to his vision. There was so much attention to detail. He selected street names on his own, right?
He had a group of, there are lots of great stories about sitting around the table with his wife and with his team, because he had a fantastic team of Frank Button, the landscape architect, and he had Denman Fink, his uncle, and he had architects like Phineas Paste. And they had this image of what the place would be, and they wanted the street names to actually inspire the kind of place they hoped Coral Gables would be. There's a great book out on the naming of Coral Gables streets, actually, and it tells the story of each street.
Oh, my Lord.
Yeah.
And, you know, so he did all this, and he planned for entrances and themed villages.
Yes.
So now we're learning there's even, you know, a plan for what you should have in your backyard. So,
Well, yes.
I mean, so
It's
tell me
true.
about that.
Well, because it was a plantation, you know, it was a grove, essentially a grapefruit grove, and then he added other fruit over time. He really believed in the benefits of the fruit trees, and so he felt that every home should have a citrus tree growing in it. And then Frank Button, who was his landscape architect, wrote a number of articles advising people about their home gardens, because they felt it didn't matter how small your property was, every property could have a garden of some kind, whether it was a tiny little courtyard or an expansive estate. He teamed up with John Gifford. John Gifford was a botany professor at the University of Miami, and they had a theory of how you could farm here, which was what basically arboriculture, that you would grow trees instead of growing fields. And they planned the whole south of Cocoa Plum area as 5-acre estates, that people would grow various kinds of fruit trees. And that would be, and you can imagine how beautiful that would be. And some of the properties actually still have those groves on them.
Wow. And so basically they were selling a vision.
They were complete.
They were selling a lifestyle.
A lifestyle, an image of life. He actually would write these scripts for his salespeople, and he talks about how you would convince someone from Ohio to leave the comforts of their family and home to come to this raw place. And he said the only way this could happen is if people could imagine a fantastic lifestyle and they could imagine themselves in it, and that the salespeople had to create a narrative that people could then inhabit. That part maybe not so unusual for sales, but what is unusual is he actually believed that when you participated in this new life, you would be a better person, because he just thought that if all of the right ingredients were here, people would be smarter and happier and healthier. And
so going back to that garden idea, you had mentioned that he had this big idea of the whole city being a garden. Tell me about that.
He did. He imagined, first of all, he had this great, like if you go to Versailles, there's a huge axis, right, as you come through the center. Well, he had as his axis Granada Boulevard, and his idea was that it went from the edge of where the Tamiami Trail came in, and then it wound through the city all the way to the Cocoa Plum, through the Cocoa Plum Circle, and then down along what is today Old Cutler. And he said that was going to be like the Malecon in Havana, because he felt there was a 50-foot strip of a promenade, and he had the public beach, because Cocoa Plum at that time, he had Tahiti Beach, it was going to be a casino, and you could take a gondola from the Biltmore Hotel to the beachfront casino.
Wow.
And so he had this vision of the great boulevard, and then off of that he had encircled other boulevards, like Alhambra was going to be a botanical garden and bridle path. And his image was that as you went from the Great Boulevard, then there was the concourse. So, for example, where the University Metro Rail station is, he imagined this like Grand Central Station. And then he had this elaborate connection of canals. So, for example, right in front of Ponce de Leon Middle School, you know where that area is, where the boulevards all kind of come together in a slightly unusual way. Well, that's because that was a yacht basin. That was his initial plan, was for that to be a yacht basin, Riviera yacht basin. And then along where behind the French Village on Hardy, he imagined a sanatorium like the Kellogg Sanatorium. He writes about it having all the benefits of the Michigan without the detriments of the Michigan weather.
My gosh.
So he envisioned this complete, and everywhere you went, you always had this sense of being in a garden, beautiful lush trees, native landscape, and then adding exotics. And today, if you drive down Maggiore, for example, and the poincianas are in bloom and it's spectacular, you can just imagine that that's what he thought the whole city would look like.
Yeah. Now, as you mentioned, not the entire city came out that way. I mean, there's much more streets and a lot more traffic. But he also wanted it to be a bustling city as well.
Absolutely. So, for example, on Miracle Mile, the center had streetcars running up and down it. So he felt like you had kind of two options in the urban center. One was that you had a large median, and it either had the streetcar or it was covered with street trees. Or if it was a narrow street, you'd have colonnades, vine-covered pergolas, awnings. So you'd always have this shady, cool way to move through the city. And then he felt like the major spaces had to be punctuated with fountains. And he has a great piece that he writes about the fact of, he calls it the great lifts of clouds. And he felt that we didn't have mountains, we didn't have that kind of scenery, but what we had were these beautiful skyscapes. And where do you see a skyscape? Well, you see it reflected in the water. So he felt that having these major public fountains would kind of bring the sky. So as you're walking along and it's hot and you're looking down, all of a sudden you just see this beautiful expanse of sky, and it reminds you to look up. Which actually is in line with his thinking. You know, his father was a Congregationalist minister over at Plymouth Congregational Church. And he did believe that you had to constantly look up. You had to think about what was beyond. And he felt the city could help a person do that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Joanne. Very nice stories. And it's so nice to see the story of George Merrick and what he originally had planned for the city and how it's evolved throughout the years.
It's an amazing story. Thank you, Valkis.
And then if you'd like more information and you'd like to read up more about that George Merrick vision, there's a great book which Joanne has actually participated in writing, which is Coral Gables, An American Garden City. And you can get that at Books and Books. And there's still much more to come on Coral Gables Now. Environmentally friendly lighting and bedding made out of recycled materials. Find out what other garden ideas were on tap at the Eco Expo. Plus, meet the man responsible for the Coral Gables Museum's beautiful fuel gallery. And wondering where to take your pooch during the doggy days of summer? We'll have just the place. We'll be right back.